So, today we are going to start looking at the muscular system. We're going to go into types of muscle and some structures within our skeletal muscle, as that makes up the majority of the muscle that we have. So if you all could popcorn this out, anyone could start.
How do types of muscle tissues relate to their locations and characteristics?
How does smooth muscle produce peristalsis?
Peristalsis.
What is the structure of skeletal muscle?
So there are three major categories of muscles, or types of muscles: smooth, cardiac, and skeletal. And we'll go into each one of these in detail. So our first one is our smooth muscle, and this is what's considered to be part of the involuntary group of muscles. And there's a couple different ways that they're organized. So there's a multi-unit, which means that there's multiple fibers that are connected, and then one fiber ends up being stimulated, and the adjacent fibers, so like there's one signal and then it just expands and propels through. And then there's visceral, which is a single unit, so there's a sheet of muscle cells that all have their own stimulus as a part of the nerve. So you see A is visceral, so it's like a flat sheet of smooth muscle. B is that multi-unit of smooth muscle, but you can see how they're kind of more grouped instead of a sheet. And it's just a different type of organization, just so that you can have multiple structures within muscle cells. Okay, and then the reason why it's called smooth muscle is because there's no visible striations. Striations are known as like lines in the muscle. And I'll explain when we get to skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle, I'll explain why there's lines. Can y'all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Cool.
It's very quiet not open.
On God. Oh, I just said on God. That's it. Sorry. On God?
This one there's visible stripes like the muscle flap, anything with like skin, and then like when your skin is stretched, does that have anything to do with it?
So that's a different phenomenon.
Oh, okay.
Turn the air on.
So your muscles actually, I'll explain why your muscles have lines in them, but your skin is a different, it's a different breakdown. All right.
Like everybody says.
So the main thing
It's so cold.
that our smooth muscle does is a process called peristalsis. And this is the involuntary contraction and relaxation of smooth muscle. So if you think about your esophagus, when you swallow, right, like say you're eating food and you swallow, that act of swallowing is voluntary, but it moving down into your stomach is involuntary. And so this process is what moves that food down. This also happens in your small intestine and your large intestine as well, because those are both smooth muscles. So a lot of your internal digestive tract is all smooth muscle. So it's a lot of involuntary. You don't control like when you digest things or how your stomach moves, right? You just control what you put into it. Any questions about this? So pretty much the way that it works is that there's a part of the muscle that will contract and it'll push food down and it'll continue to contract above it so that it continues to move down. Question? Alright, so now we have our cardiac muscle. And so this is also involuntary, right? We don't control our own heart rate. We don't have to think about it all the time. And the reason why it's striated, or it has lines, so you see all those little tiny lines? That's because there's two types of filaments within the muscle, and it's the same thing with skeletal muscle. So it has both thick and thin, which is why you get the thick are the darker lines, the light are the lighter lines, and those are composed of actin and myosin. Actin is the thick, myosin is the thin. Oh wait, no. Sorry, I flipped that. Myosin is thick, actin is thin. And then within the cardiac muscles, you have the cardiomyocytes, which are otherwise known as heart muscle cells. So they're like, when you break up the word, like cardio always means heart, myo means muscle, cyte means cell, so you have heart muscle cells.
So cells consist of all three. So cells consist of all three.
The cells consist of all three.
Yeah, because raw it's like cells are all cardiomyocytes.
Yeah, so these muscles, like the cells that are in your heart, are your cardiomyocytes. Yeah. And then they have these things called intercalated discs. You see these like dark lines here? Those are actually for communication. And these cells are actually branched as well, which is pretty interesting. So not a lot of cells are branched. You can kind of see it here, where there's this is like one cell. But that just helps for rapidity of sending signals through your heart. And then those intercalated discs allow for constant movement of signals. So, cardiomyocytes, heart muscle cells, have a lot of mitochondria. Why do you think so? Why would that be the case? What do you think? What do mitochondria do?
The powerhouse of the cell.
Okay, sure. Catchphrase.
Yeah.
So what do they do though? Like why are they considered to do that? Do you remember? They produce a specific molecule. Yeah.
They produce energy to it was through the dots that are there, the little,
Here?
yeah. I forgot what it was called, but when they go through them.
Yeah. So pretty much mitochondria, right? They're the powerhouse of the cell. They create our energy-rich molecules. So there's something called ATP, which is known as adenosine triphosphate, and that is it's like our energy currency for our body. And so, why would it make sense to have an organelle that produces a lot of energy and to have a lot of those within the heart cells? Yeah.
Well, because the heart is always moving?
Yeah, right? It's always contracting and pumping your blood through your body, right? If we didn't have that source of energy, we wouldn't really be living. Right, because our blood needs to be pumped through our body in order for our cells to survive and to live, right? And so that excess, like the amount of mitochondria is proportional to what our heart needs. Those are here. Again, mitochondria because of the need for energy, so your heart is constantly using that energy to pump your blood around the body, filter gases, and so it needs a constant supply of energy, and that energy comes from ATP that's produced by the mitochondria. And so all of your general cells do have mitochondria. your cardiomyocytes just have more. Because all cells need to have some sort of energy source in order to stay alive. And then, since we're talking about heart rate, there's actually two significant hormones that help regulate your heart muscle. One is called norepinephrine, and that mobilizes the brain and body for action. And then you have epinephrine, which is also known as adrenaline, and that speeds up your heart rate.
Speeds up?
Speeds up, yep. Right, because when you're scared, right, or when you say you go on like a roller coaster, and you're like, woo, that was so much fun. Like you're gonna have a huge influx of adrenaline, and that will create, and then that's also known as epinephrine, and that will speed up your heart rate because your body's like, oh, let's go, let's go, let's go. We have all this energy now. We're gonna like run everywhere. Yeah. It's also a part of your fear response. So say like fight or flight, you're gonna need adrenaline to kickstart your body and say, okay, what do I need to do to escape this situation? Say like if a big predator was like chasing after you like thousands of years ago, right? Like you definitely want to get away as fast as possible.
Doesn't that also give you strength?
Yeah, it's like invisible strength. Yeah. So like it doesn't actually make your muscles like stronger, but it makes them ready to act faster.
Because I was reading this news article, it was like really interesting that this lady, her baby got stuck under a car, I think. And because of all of that, like, you know, fear and strength, she was able to actually pick up the car somewhat and like get the baby out.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting thing about adrenaline. So it kind of blocks your other sensory. So like you might not.
Isn't that dangerous?
It is dangerous if it's at a high level. So like that parent could have been injured because of moving the car, right? But in a life or death situation, right? You don't need your other sensory like things. You just need to be able to get out of the situation. And so that's probably why like that adrenaline gave her the boost to then be able to like get to safety. Yeah.
I have a question. So for the first one, would they feel it? Like, let's say if she did get hurt, she wouldn't feel it in that moment, right? She would feel it like after the collision happened.
Yeah. So like adrenaline blocks your other sensory receptors. So like sometimes pain, you don't feel as much. If you get injured during like a sports game or something like that, like I definitely did at one point. I didn't really feel it until later, like after the game when adrenaline was processed, and I was like, oh, that hurts. Like, ow. And then I thought back, I'm like, oh, that's where that happened. Like, I understand now.
Right. And then for the second question, isn't epinephrine a drug? Or am I confusing with
Yeah, so we can make these.
Right.
And it allows, like, it's considered a drug, yeah. If you're taking it as it's made from, like, a doctor or, like, a pharmacist, right? But these are also naturally occurring.
Okay, good.
So we can make our own version of it.
I was like, I've heard of it before, but I'm like, I'm just expensive.
Yeah, like an EpiPen. That's it. Right, because it kickstarts your body into protecting and not going into like a complete shock, right? So why do smooth and cardiac muscles need to be involuntary? What do you think?
Always need to be working.
Always need to be working, yeah. Should we have to like think about our heart rate like 24/7?
We should.
But like in order to control it.
Oh,
like,
no.
If we were thinking about it for the entire day, even while we were sleeping, like we can't do that, right? We wouldn't be able to sleep if we had to consciously think about regulating our heart rate. Because there's actually a part of the brain that helps with signaling, and we'll talk about that when we get into brain structures and our nervous system. Yeah. Right, because you don't have to think about like digestion for like hours on end, right? Like that would get kind of boring.
Wait, miss, what is breathing like? Because you can
What's that?
voluntarily breathe, but you can also involuntarily breathe.
Yeah, so some things are a combination, right? So like if you don't think about your breathing, right, it just happens
It just
naturally.
made me think about my breathing.
But say if you're going to like meditate or you're like you need to catch your breath, right? You are able to be like conscious about it, and so there's certain processes that can be done.
So the scientific reason is actually.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, so because they're in constant motion, right? You don't want to have to think about it actively.
Okay.
Right, because if you had to think about it, you'd have to say, okay, or contract, or relax, contract, relax, contract, relax, right?
Because you'd have to think about it.
It's a lot.
Time in your hands.
It's a lot to process for sure.
Sleeping in the
Alright, so now our third type of muscle, so this is our voluntary muscle. Like cardiac muscle, it is also striated, so it has lines of muscle fibers. As you can see, this is a lot more organized and not branched compared to our cardiac muscle. So this type of muscle is involved in body movement, it's involved in posture, and shivering. So most of the actions that you're doing right now are considered to be voluntary, and you're using your skeletal muscle.
When you start shivering, that's my muscles.
I'd be shivering.
Yeah, so when you're cold, right, your body wants to either keep in the heat or create heat. And so when your body shivers, it actually is releasing ATP and like breaking those bonds, which is why you feel slightly warmer after you shiver. Yeah. So your muscles are actually like contracting really, really fast and using a bunch of ATP and using that heat that your body
What's the
uses
code
to
when
warm.
you like?
Why does this all sound familiar?
Hold on.
It sure sucks taking showers.
What's the word for it?
You can't shiver from that?
Everybody's shaking. Like say like you get too cold.
It'd be warm like that.
This whole like hard of
Like how to get
Oh, you like your.
Remember that meme that you say that at this world?
That's just like a large box. Like, they just talk about it.
Coffee with the chills.
You're like, oh. Yeah, it's not necessarily like you're
Hey.
Josh, did you have a question?
No. ATP energy sounds familiar. That's what.
Yeah. It's our big transceiver stuff. There you go.
Hey. Would you like to a girl like that, bro?
So, you have a big picture of this in your notes on the next page. But this is the structure of our skeletal muscles. So within our muscles, there's a lot of different levels of organization. So you go from your bone, right? This might be your femur. So you have a tendon that connects the bone to your muscle.
Here's a question.
Yeah.
The arrow section, we put it on D, right?
Yep. Alright, so this first one is muscle. The second one is something called fascicles. I can also spell it out if you.
Yes, please.
So, muscle. That is just like in general the big muscle, right? The next one is something called fascicle. And those are, let's see where it's like a section within your muscle. So it's the next section going down. So muscle is here. Fascicle is here. And then you have your muscle fibers, which are your cells. And those are, where are they? There we go. Muscle fibers right here. And then you have your myofibrils. that is,
It's a seizure.
Here.
and then you have your thick and thin filaments. And those are here.
Thank you guys.
So we'll go into each part of these, so that you can understand a little bit more. But from the biggest structure to the smallest structure. So tendons are what connect bone to muscle. I'm forgetting the muscle to muscle one, but there's another connective tissue that connects. Alright, is it okay if I erase?
Yes, yes.
We're good?
Yeah.
Okay. So talking about, again, our skeletal muscle. So there is a dense connective tissue called fascia that separates individual skeletal muscles from their adjacent muscles and hold them in position. So each muscle, like our muscles, are surrounded by a dense connective tissue layer. Now we have fascicles, and those are bundles of skeletal muscle fibers. And so this one here is a single muscle fiber, but if you had a bunch of those around each other, that would be called a fascicle. And then, of course, we have our skeletal muscle fiber, which is a single cell that contracts in response to stimulation and then relaxes when the stimulation ends. Is it okay if I move to the next page? Yeah, the PowerPoint's up. Alright. Any questions about these three?
No.
It's okay if I move to the next one? So, after our skeletal muscle, we have, each skeletal muscle is each skeletal muscle fiber is a long, thin cylinder with rounded ends, which is also known as a myofibril. So if you see here, we have our muscle fiber, and then we have a myofibril. So it's one of these little cylinders within the muscle. Okay. So this is what we're talking about right here, and this is a bigger view into what that is and the different sections. And we'll go over what those sections mean and what is held within those sections. Now, myofibrils also lie parallel to each other, which is pretty cool. So the structure that ended up resulting is parallel. And then there are also something called sarcomeres, and those are joined end to end. And sarcomeres pretty much is just a repeating pattern of unit within the skeletal muscle. So if you see in the lower portion of the diagram, there's a section here called sarcomere. These, when they're put end to end, like you have just a repeating pattern of that section. And sarcomeres are also known as a functional unit of muscle contraction. Cool. So getting into our sarcomeres, there is something called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And I'm going to hop back to the previous slide just for a second so I can show you where that is. So our sarcoplasmic reticulum kind of looks like spongy bone, except it's just a bunch of tubes that hold calcium, because our muscles need calcium in order to function and contract. And so this covers the entire length of the myofibril, and it's on every single myofibril. So, our next part is our actin. So our actin is our thin filament. If you see the I guess it's a bluish color. The blue part of the diagram, that is our actin. Our myosin is our thick filament that's in the muscles. And so that's the I don't even know what color that is, but it's the thicker portion in the middle. So here's our actin here. And then we have our myosin that's here. So those are the two main filaments that are in both cardiac muscle and in our skeletal muscles. And so when we're looking at our sarcomere, there's a couple different zones or bands, lines that are important to know. One of those is your A band. And so your A band is this green section here. So it's from one end of your myosin to the other. Your I band is composed of actin and has the Z line. So here, where you see this, it's from the end of one myosin to the end of the other. It does not include the myosin, but it's from one end to the other. And then our Z line is the connection points between the actin in one sarcomere with the actin in another. And so you see this dark line here. That's our Z line. So this sarcomere setup of having the thin filaments and the thick filaments is what creates our striations, or those differences in color or darkness in our muscles. And we'll go into how actin and myosin work together in order to contract our muscles. We'll probably do that a little bit later this week. I think it's super cool, how it actually works. Hopefully you all do too. Any questions about any of the information so far?
Nope.
No? Let me know when you're ready to move on to the next slide. I just have one last question for you all. And then we can play some Kahoot. Yeah, I figured it's a Monday. You need something fun to do.
God bless you.
Of course.
Because we should have something fun to do every day.
What?
We should have something fun to do every day.
I feel like we're not allowed to chew gum.
Carry on next. The rest of what I think is better.
Best are you submitting this to?
Yeah, okay, but they don't
Huh?
on canvas.
Oh, I thought we were going to give it to you.
Dude, I'm right. That's nasty.
Oh, okay.
Right here, and they're like
Alright, one last question. One last question for you all. What are the two types of muscle fibers in skeletal muscle? Yeah, are fibers. So we have two types of fibers. Within our muscle. Like what, within our skeletal muscle specifically, or our cardiac muscle, but I'm asking about skeletal muscle. What's called?
Am I right?
So, what did you say? No. So you're talking smooth muscles. You're talking process of smooth muscle. It's, one starts with an A and one starts with an F. No. We're talking fibers of, yeah.
It would be the actin and
Yes, yes. So, our myofibrils are the cells, right? Or are part of our cells and muscles. But our actin and our myosin
These are like higher material.
within our muscles.
These sweaters are cheap and
Hey, Justin.